if you're like many of us, you're probably dealing with the stresses and anxieties of the coronavirus. So what I want to talk about today are 6 strategies recommended to use to combat this kind of stress. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So, calmer and kinder, these are all ideas of reducing stress. Wisdom, of course, as well. It's wise to reduce stress. And I've done talks about reducing stress in the past here, and I think it's good to have a refresher, and particularly in the context of this coronavirus. And in fact, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control came out with a list of methods that we can use to reduce stress in our lives, and I think it's a really good list. Of course, all of us would really like some kind of easy, magical kind of answer that we could just sort of press a button and stress would go down. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work that way. There are ways that are very straightforward and relatively easy to pursue, and several of them have to do, I think, or have aspects that meet up with the Buddhist Dharma, and I'll be discussing one of those at some length in the end here. The 6th one of these. It's important, I think, to notice, though, that there are different kinds of stress. There's acute stress and there's chronic stress. The acute stress can come if we ourselves get ill, or if somebody that we know close, or a loved one, gets ill. These are the kinds of acute stresses that I think are separate, at least in part, from what I'll be discussing here. What I'll be discussing here are more ways of dealing with the chronic stress, the kind of low-grade worry that goes on in our lives if we're dealing with something like this for weeks, months, and perhaps even years. Now, also, I think these same practices can be useful in the acute case, but the acute case is a little bit different. So I'll be discussing these 6, and I'll go into some in more detail and others in less detail. So to begin with, the first one is to avoid the news. Now, this is not to say to avoid it completely. I think there's, for sure, to be informed citizens, we have to have some idea about what's going on in our culture. I think we all know that, so that we can vote properly and be informed citizens, which is part of, I think, our obligation as members of democracies. At least partial democracies anyhow. But we also, I think, all know that much of what we hear in the news is repetitious. That is to say, we really aren't learning anything particular from the news most of the time. It's just reinforcing things that we already knew, or saying the same material over and over again. And hearing that kind of material, in particular in a pretty toxic political climate in which we are now, is itself an extreme, or can be an extreme, source of stress. So the right response here is turn off the news, or at least take it out of your life. Spend enough time each day to become informed about what's necessary, and then try to avoid it. I think that's a good stress-fighting kind of tactic. The second one of these is to, and this is pretty obvious, is to avoid junk food. That's what the CDC recommends, and I think they're quite right about it. We all know that junk food doesn't make you feel very good. It's not healthy for us, especially when we're talking about chronic stress, because this coronavirus situation will be going on for quite a while. It's perfectly okay to indulge every once in a while. I admit to liking sweet things myself, but you have to be aware that if in the long haul, it's good to have a balanced diet. That's also a source of stress if we're not doing it. The third idea here is to avoid abusing intoxicants. And once again, we all know about this. And indeed, this is one of the 5 precepts we find in Buddhism. The 5th precept is to avoid intoxicants. Now, in Buddhism, there is, I would say, a disagreement among certain kinds of practitioners, whether that means to avoid them entirely, which is the more traditional approach, or more modern approach, which is to understand that the reason why that fifth precept is there is because the abuse of intoxicants makes us more likely to violate other precepts, such as stealing or lying or even injuring other people, killing them, sexual misconduct. And to the extent that, at least for some of us, we think that to the extent that we can have a glass of wine or something without that being a problem, then it's not so much of an issue. But we also know that for many of us, it may not be possible to have a glass of wine without abusing intoxicants, because perhaps we're prone to alcoholism, we've had it in the past. We know also that it's a source of calories, we know that it's not particularly healthy in general. So that's another thing that we should keep our eyes out for. The fourth CDC recommendation is to, and I'm not doing these in order, particularly as they're on the website. I'll put the website down below in case you want to see them, but is to connect with friends. And of course, I think many of us will know that connecting with friends is something that reduces stress for us. It allows us to have a bigger social life, which itself is a source of support for us. Turning to sort of a Buddhist idea of these things, I think there are a couple of points we can make here. The first point is that we want to distinguish between what we might call good friends and false friends. That is to say, we may know that there are certain people in our lives who bring out the best in us, who make us happy, who bring us towards wisdom, bring us towards generosity and kindness and compassion, while there may be other people in our lives who are angry and perhaps bring us more towards that kind of mindset or more towards a greedy mindset. That is to say, there are certain people who are not as good for us. And for the Buddha, it was important to distinguish, to make that distinction if we can, and to center ourselves towards the more beneficial friends. Also, there may be false friends who are not really using us to our best advantage, that is to say, who may be out to get stuff from us and not give. There are many ways that we can distinguish a true from a false friend, but the Buddha's point here would be that if you have false friends, it's perhaps better to leave them aside. Search out true friends. Another thing that the Buddha did say is that the life of practice is made better with friends. That indeed, true friendship is, as he says, all of the life of practice. Because true friends help keep us on the right path. Once again, true friends. So having true friends and keeping in contact with them, if we can't do it in person, then let's say over Zoom or FaceTime or whatever, the internet, can be great sources of solace for us. The fifth recommendation from the CDC that I'll discuss here is to exercise regularly. And this is, to my mind, one of the most satisfactory, one of the best ways to avoid stress is to do regular exercise, however you can manage it. To do it regularly, that is to say, if possible, let's say 5 days a week. You'll find that exercise improves your outlook on life. It improves your confidence. It improves your mental state. It also gives you more energy. I think one of the misunderstandings about exercise among people who don't do it is they think that if they exercise, it's going to make them tired. And in the short term, that may be true. If you're very out of shape, then exercising can make you feel very, very tired. However, if you keep it up for even a few days and keep it up for longer and to the point where you're getting more in shape, you will find that doing regular exercise gives you much more energy than you would have otherwise. It makes you much more awake and alive. And So you'll get to a point where you really feel you understand the importance to exercise, not simply from the sense of physical health, which all of us know, and many of these things have to do with physical health, but with mental health too, that it really does make a huge difference. So I would very much suggest you find some way of doing regular exercise. I understand that many of us are limited in our abilities to exercise now because of this coronavirus, but there are ways of getting a regular walk in, or a run, or a jog, or whatever we can do there, or even to have ways. There are even lots of videos here on YouTube about doing exercise at home. I think it's good to have both, shall we say, cardio and weights. That is to say, both in tandem, I think, work better than either of them individually. Again, you can read more about that many different places other than here. So yes, this does take some time and effort to do, but I think it's very much worth it. We'll find our lives much better if we do that. The same is true with the sixth of these recommendations by the CDC, which many of us will find familiar, which is to meditate. I would say try to block out some time every day to do meditation. Whatever time that is better than nothing. The more time, the better, although I think you will understand that you don't have a limitless amount of time to do that. But thinking of more rather than less as being better, and starting our way there. Now, the question is, for many of you, perhaps you, how do you meditate? What is the right approach here? I would suggest we start meditating by focusing on the breath. This regular oscillating motion of the breath in and out is a very calming kind of thing to pay attention to. Because again, of its regularity. It's always with us, so we don't need to go somewhere or buy something to find it. It's right here with us all the time. So if we spend our time focusing on it, we'll find that simply by focusing on it, let's say with our eyes closed, seated in a comfortable position that we can maintain for a while without pain, if we can do that, we'll find ourselves naturally calming down. We can also do something else which is called a body scan, which is related to the first, where with our eyes closed, we start at the feet, we work our way up the body, let's say feet, and then lower legs, and then upper legs, or one leg at a time. And what we do, one way to approach this, there are many different ways, but one way to approach this is simply to feel what's there. And if we find some tension in that part of the body, we give ourselves permission to release that tension. And we'll often find, or at least I often find, tension, let's say the shoulders or the neck, or the face is a great source of tension, around the eyes, around the jaw. And so we pay attention to this quietly over a period of time. When we find the tension, we release that tension. And if the tension persists, then we're simply aware of it in a non-judgmental fashion. Indeed, part of the point of doing this kind of meditation is to foster this kind of non-judgmental attitude while we're seated or lying down or in this kind of formal meditation. What it's called in the Zen community is just sit. They'll say just sit. That is to say, you sit on your cushion in your chair with a kind of open awareness of just allowing whatever comes to come without any judgment of it, simply being aware of it. And one of the things that we can also do in this kind of practice is to name or note things as they arise in our experience. Whether they arise in the world, that is to say, a sound that we might hear, or a pain that we might have, or a feeling of, let's say, wind on our face, or if it's something internal, such as a thought that arises. Usually it'll be, for most of us, I think, thoughts that arise. And we'll find our mind crowding in with thoughts. And if we can name them, let's say, naming it as planning, or daydreaming, or remembering something from the past, thinking about the future, if we simply name the thoughts, they enter into our awareness, and we'll find that they oftentimes will just go away on their own. And we simply are aware of this, again, in this kind of open awareness. And while we do this, we use the breath as a kind of an anchor. Almost like you might say the sort of the percussion notes of a song, where it's sort of always there underneath what's happening. And we can always come back to it. Always let the mind come back to the breath. And then open up, again in a non-judgmental way, just being aware of the thoughts arising and passing. This is sort of the beginning stages of meditation, and it's a process of meditation that is both calming in the sense of relaxing us, reducing stress, but it's also the kind of meditation that is really the basis of every kind of, certainly early Buddhist meditation that there is. And so it's something that we can do really for our entire lives in one way or another. And what I would recommend is to, if you haven't done this before, start with a relatively short period of time, let's say 5 or 10 minutes, and try to work yourselves up to maybe half an hour a day, or 45 minutes if you have time for that. Of course, if you have time for more, even better, but most of us don't. But that's the kind of the approach that you want to have to doing meditation on a regular basis. And I personally find that it helps to do meditation after exercise, because that's when I'm at my most awake. And since I'm at my most awake, I have the most energy. The meditation seems to be a little bit more enjoyable for me, rather than doing it later on in the day. But each of us is different, and so you have to find out your own time and space for it. And what we want to do now with all of these 6 is to lay down a kind of an approach to practice which will carry us into the rest of our lives. A healthy approach to life. Because while this coronavirus may go on for quite some time, let's be honest, it's not going to go on forever. It too will pass, and we'll be back to our normal lives. And there is the, I think, rosy-eyed glasses way of looking back into the past, this sort of grass is always greener kind of thought, that sort of says, oh, when we're back to our normal lives, stress will go away, we'll no longer have to deal with stress, and we'll all be fine. But I think a moment's reflection will reveal that we had plenty of stress and anxiety even well before this coronavirus. Stress and anxiety are part of the human condition. Indeed, they're universal. They're the sorts of things that the Buddha called the first noble truth. The first noble truth being that life is in some sense unsatisfactory because it's full of stresses and anxieties. It's full of our worries. And so what we want to do here, and what I hope comes across in these 6 ways that the CDC recommends, is that they're necessary not just for now. They're necessary for the rest of our lives. They're necessary for all the time. And that to the extent that we can lay down good habits right now, good practices right now, we're going to be in much better state when the coronavirus is finished, because we'll already have these things. We'll already be doing them regularly. And so when we're back to our ordinary lives, we'll find those lives are better, are fuller, are less stressful, because we're doing the right things. Now, if you don't know much about meditation, I have earlier videos on mindfulness meditation, in particular mindfulness for beginners. What I've been describing here can be seen as mindfulness meditation, which perhaps you've heard of. Now, I have an earlier video on that. I'll put it up here on the screen if you want to know more, a little bit more detail about how to do that kind of mindfulness meditation. So I suggest you take that up as well as these other practices. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, all of you be well.